agents on hand to screen cargo, migrants, and travelers, our ports of entry are less secure than ever before, creating a serious national security threat. Last but certainly not least, staffing shortages, reassignments, and inadequate training of CBP agents have led to the inhumane and haphazard treatment of asylum seekers and migrant families. As we saw just last month, DHS officials recently opted to house hundreds of migrants for several days under a bridge in unsanitary conditions. In another recent move, CBP abruptly released hundreds of migrant families into border communities, overwhelming local shelters and municipal services. While we were down in Texas, we had the opportunity to sit down with local advocates, asylum seekers, law enforcement officials, and business owners to discuss the impact that these policies were having locally, and specifically how staffing shortages at our ports of entry were playing out on the ground in real time. We started our trip with a visit to the Annunciation House in El Paso, Texas, a nonprofit organization that has served as a way station for migrants for 40 years. It's run solely by volunteers, and its services are supported entirely by private donations. After the administration implemented its policy of releasing hundreds of migrant families into border communities, the Annunciation House received anywhere from 500 to 850 families each day. We also held a roundtable discussion with local business owners whose livelihood depended on cross-border trade. They described 10 miles of backed-up trucks in Mexico waiting for 25 hours to cross into the United States. And finally, we heard from CBP agents themselves, who were stretched so thin that they worried they might miss something, either drugs, weapons, or something far worse. The administration's border policies, coupled with the president's threats to close the border altogether and his incendiary immigration rhetoric, have created utter chaos and confusion at our ports of entry. They have made us less safe, they have undermined our trade partnerships, and they have put thousands of asylum seekers in harm's way. But make no mistake, this is not a funding issue or an issue of congressional cooperation. Congress recently passed a bipartisan budget that would allocate $60 million to DHS to hire over 1,000 new CBP agents. The issue we face right now is a leadership and management problem. The anti-immigrant directives coming from the president, along with DHS officials that have been purged or rendered powerless by White House senior advisor Stephen Miller, leave CBP and ICE rudderless and unaccountable to Congress. The presidential memorandum issued last night is just another example of the White House attempting to unilaterally change our asylum laws while circumventing Congress. So today's hearing will give members of this committee the opportunity to hear directly from some of the individuals living and working in our border communities. We will hear about how businesses, migrants, and advocacy groups and law enforcement officials have been affected by this administration's latest immigration and border policies. I want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us this morning. I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here. The crisis at our southern border is worsening by the day and is a result of decades of congressional inaction or inadequate action and loopholes in our current laws. If combined to leave us ill-prepared to handle this crisis. This fiscal year, Customs and Border Protection is on track to apprehend the highest number of illegal migrants since 2008, a number greater than the entire population of the city of New Orleans in my home state of Louisiana. Border Patrol processing facilities were not built to house families and children, which were seen in record numbers, of course. El Paso, Rio Grande Valley, and Yuma facilities are all far beyond capacity. Migrants are telling Border Patrol agents that they're bringing children because smugglers have told them they'll be released if they do. This raises serious safety concerns and heightens the risk of human trafficking. According to Customs and Border Protection, there have been over 3,000 cases since April 2018 where an adult claiming to be a parent or a legal guardian of a child was found not to be. Groups of more than 100 migrants are arriving at the southwest border at unprecedented levels. Over the last 6 months, 104 groups of that size have been encountered by CBP. Comparatively, there were only 2 such groups in all of 2017. In the past 4 months, Border Patrol agents have spent more than 100,000 man-hours transporting migrants to hospital. This takes these agents off the line of duty. This crisis is fueled by a combination of loopholes in our immigration laws, which we must fix, and a backlog in immigration courts that prevent consequences from being delivered to those illegally entering our country without legitimate asylum claims. The situation at the border is so bad that the CBP Office of Field Operations has reassigned over 500 officers from land ports of entry to help Border Patrol with processing. This has led to increased wait times for legal travel and trade. This diversion of resources poses a serious risk to individuals that man the border and risk of individuals slipping through our border who wish to do harm to this nation. This is a concern. Last month, CBP and ICE told Congress that due to resource constraints, they no longer have the ability to process, transport, and detain all migrants attempting unauthorized entry at the southwest border. They just can't handle the flow. They're being forced to release families into local border communities without screening them for credible fear or outfitting adults with GPS tracking bracelets. Right now, there are no consequences to entering our country illegally. This only encourages illegal immigration and puts both Americans and migrants at risk. The non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, that Customs and Border Protection and ICE usually partner with to house overflows of migrants have been pushed beyond their own capacity. There's no relief without additional resources from Congress. As a result, our local border communities are becoming overwhelmed and overrun. Sheriff Napier can tell us firsthand that border sheriffs are receiving the largest volume of drugs they've seen in years and are increasingly coming across migrants that have made it past Border Patrol who need immediate humanitarian assistance. We're a nation of law and order. However, this is chaos that we face at the southern border. Without changing the laws and providing the Department of Homeland Security adequate resources to address these issues, we're tying the hands of the men and women we have entrusted to keep the homeland safe. This crisis is diminishing American safety, security, economic prosperity, and the integrity of our southwest border. We must address it head on, or it will continue to get worse. I'm looking forward to hearing testimony from our witnesses about the impact of this crisis on border communities, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Additionally, I ask unanimous consent that the members of the full committee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses as appropriate. Without objection, so ordered. I welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, Mr. John Barela, is the CEO of the Borderplex Alliance, a nonprofit organization dedicated to economic development and policy advocacy in the Ciudad Juarez, El Paso, and southern New Mexico region. Prior to becoming the CEO of the Alliance in 2016, Mr. Barela served as New Mexico's Economic Development Cabinet Secretary, where he led unprecedented efforts to develop and attract investments to the North American Borderplex and increase trade with Mexico. He has also worked at Intel Corporation and at Maudrell Sperling Law Firm. Mr. Barela has an international relations degree with honors from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Next, we have Mr. Efren Olivares. Mr. Olivares is the Racial and Economic Justice Director at the Texas Civil Rights Project. Mr. Olivares handles and supervises cases in state and federal court involving institutional discrimination, constitutional violations, immigrants' rights, disability and economic rights, among others. Mr. Olivares joined TCRP's South Texas office in 2013 after working at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and at Fulbright and Jaworski, LLP. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Yale Law School. Next, we have Bishop Mark Seitz, who has been Bishop of the Diocese of El Paso since 2013. He has served on the Diocesan Liturgical Commission and the Committee for Continuing Education of Priests, and is a member of the Presbyteral Council and the College of Consultors in the Diocese of Dallas. Bishop Seitz was named a Prelate of Honor, a Monsignor, by His Holiness Pope John Paul II in December of 2004. Bishop Seitz is also an author and in 2017 released Sorrow and Mourning Flee Away, Pastoral Letter on Migration to the People of God in the Diocese of El Paso. Finally, we have Sheriff Mark Napier, the Sheriff of Pima County, Arizona. He started his law enforcement career in December of 1981 as a police officer in Iowa before moving to the Tucson Police Department in 1987, where he eventually retired. He then served as the Assistant Director for the Glendale, Arizona Police Department and worked for the Department of Justice as a peer reviewer on federal grant programs. He is here today as a member and representative of the Southwestern Border Sheriff's Coalition, which represents 31 counties along the U.S.-Mexico border. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, and we will start with Mr. Barela.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. It's an absolute privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Members of the committee, thank you also for our ability to testify today. The Borderplex Alliance is, to my knowledge, the only privately funded organization that serves as the policy advocacy and economic development arm for our region. And our region consists of 2.5 million individuals, as the chairwoman stated. Ciudad Juarez, El Paso County, and Doña Ana County, New Mexico, my home county, are really the crux and, to me, the heart of trade for the United States. In fact, almost 1/5 of the trade between the United States and Mexico occurs through our various ports of entry. $82 billion last year of trade occurred through our ports of entry in the region. And we, in many ways, style ourselves as the gateway of trade for the Americas. So it's clear that the symbiotic relationship that we have with our southern neighbors is important to our region. But this morning, I'd like to explain how the symbiotic nature of the relationship between the United States and Mexico provides between 5 to 6 million American jobs, collectively in all of your states, over 1.2 million jobs. Let me state at the outset that I believe firmly that Mexico is an economic and strategic ally of the United States. It is not a foe. As I mentioned, between 5 and 6 million American jobs rely directly on trade with Mexico. It has just recently become the #1 trading partner. For the first 2 months, the #1 trading partner, eclipsing China and Canada. #1 trading partner, again, of the United States. What we are experiencing along the border, however, threatens the economic security of our country. Our country is doing very well. We're at full employment. Our region reflects that. El Paso's unemployment rate is below 4% at 3.9%, and even in Ciudad Juarez, the unemployment rate is at 3.6%. Second thesis I'd like to put out today is that trade is not a zero-sum game. As I've said many, many times, a job created in Ciudad Juarez ought to be a job created in the United States. Unfortunately, what we are experiencing right now with the difficulties that are currently being experienced is creating economic devastation potentially for our area. 2 particular circumstances. A gentleman who runs a medical device industry has recently had to furlough, because of the supply chain in Ciudad Juarez and New Jersey, has had to furlough dozens of workers in New Jersey and move those to Eastern Europe. A second individual who owns an auto supply scrap business. He takes scrap materials, scrap iron and metals, provides them to industries in Mexico, which then form them into auto parts, is currently operating at 20% capacity and has had to furlough employees. He explained to me that if these supply parts, these parts that go into automotive production in the United States, is not provided on time, it will have a very, very adverse effect on automotive production in the United States. So as we move forward And I do appreciate the comments made by the chairwoman and the ranking member, Congressman Higgins. We appreciate that very much. And we're in total agreement that the ripple effect could turn into a tsunami for the United States if we don't solve these wait times, which we are currently experiencing between 8 and 24 hours as we speak. And we simply cannot do business in our region, nor can the United States afford this sort of ripple effect, which again will become an economic tsunami if we're not careful. We must remain competitive as a North American region, and we must provide the adequate resources in a bipartisan, pragmatic way to help the courageous officers that we have working these very difficult issues day in and day out. Last thing I'll say before my formal comments are done is that this has been an issue that has been decades in the making. For many, many years, we've said that our ports of entry have been woefully and inadequately funded. And it's not a mutually exclusive idea to secure our borders, which we all support, and to facilitate legitimate commerce. And so therefore we urge respectfully that significantly more resources be put in to help infrastructure along our ports of entry in the southern border. And with that, Madam Chair, I appreciate very much the ability to be here. Thank you so much for the honor and privilege to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Barilla. Mr. Olivares?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here providing testimony before this committee this morning. I'm an attorney with the Texas Civil Rights Project, and my office represents landowners whose land the government is trying to condemn in order to build a border wall in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. Our office has represented these landowners for over 10 years now, since the 2008 border fence wave of condemnations. And this morning, I want to touch on briefly two types of impact that this policy is having on border communities, particularly in the Rio Grande Valley. First, the eminent domain process and how it leaves landowners wondering how they can oppose a taking of their land by the federal government. And secondly, some of the broader impacts that the border wall will have on border communities and is already having. When the government identifies a property where they want to build a border wall, they first try to purchase it from the landowner voluntarily. They make an offer of sale. And historically, those offers have been woefully below market value. Now, how far below market value? One of the cases that our office handled, the initial offer was for $100 for 1.3 acres of land in Cameron County, and the case ended up settling for $56,000. That's a multiple of 560 times the value of the land. And that's not atypical. And part of the problem is that the initial offer of purchase from the government doesn't have to be backed up by a formal appraisal. So the government can make any offer at once, and especially if the landowner is not represented, they have a very hard time defending against in those processes. Another important piece of the process is that in virtually every case, the government tries to get physical possession of the land before the issue of just compensation is resolved. And unfortunately, the eminent domain process allows for that. Federal courts routinely grant the government physical possession of the land before the landowner has received a dime for their property. This has resulted in dozens of landowners having lost the land to the government, having the border wall built literally on their backyard, and then years later not have received a single dollar for that as just compensation as required by the Fifth Amendment. Such is the case of Ms. Maria Garcia in the city of San Benito in Cameron County. The border fence was built on her backyard back in 2012, and Ms. Garcia unfortunately passed away in November of 2017 and never received a dime for her property. Many other landowners, including some of our clients, have been in the process for over 10 years, and the government has changed how much of their property it wants to take, and the landowners have been living with the uncertainty looming over their heads without having received any compensation in more than 10 years by now. Another important factor that makes the eminent domain process terribly unfair to the landowners is the fact that the Secretary of Homeland Security can waive all laws, except for the Constitution and treaties. But every other law, the Secretary of Homeland Security can waive pursuant to a waiver authority granted by Congress, and it has been described as the broadest waiver authority ever granted by Congress that allows him or her to waive every law, so that leaves the landowners not being able to challenge the taking other than challenge the amount of just compensation. Now, on the effects that the border wall is going to have on the community, one thing that is often lost in the discussion is the fact that the wall is planned to be built many hundreds of yards from the actual border, from the river itself. So Professor Madsen from the Ohio State University has calculated that in Texas alone, 43,000 acres are going to be walled off from the rest of the country. They're going to become no man's land. And of those 43,000 acres, 42,000 acres are in the Rio Grande Valley alone, which are the 3 counties in the southeasternmost tip of Texas, Cameron, Hidalgo, and Starr counties. And in those areas, between what's going to become the wall and the river, the so-called no man's land, there are communities, there are neighborhoods, there are businesses that are going to be walled off from public utilities, from roads, public transportation, and everything that's on the northern side of the wall. Some landowners may get gates, but not all of them. Not everyone's going to get a gate, so not everyone gets access to their property. Now, imagine for a second if the federal government were walling off 43,000 acres of U.S. soil, not along the Rio Grande, but along the Potomac or along the Hudson. It would be a scandal. But in our community in South Texas, a majority Latino, Hispanic community, it's unfortunately something that we've become all too familiar, and our office will continue to do everything we can to represent these landowners so that they are treated fairly and with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alvarez. Bishop Seitz?
I'm the Catholic Bishop of the Diocese of El Paso. I would like to thank the House Committee on Homeland Security and this subcommittee, as well as the subcommittee chair, Representative Rice, and Ranking Member Higgins, for the opportunity to testify today. In my Diocese of El Paso, I've witnessed an extraordinary community response to the increasing number of asylum-seeking families we have seen since November. Our community is being led in our response to provide respite for arriving asylum-seeking families by a local entity, Annunciation House, whom you mentioned. In November, my diocese also made the choice to open 2 shelters, one on the grounds of the Diocesan Pastoral Center and one located in downtown El Paso. We realized that without these shelters, asylum seekers would have no other option and be released to the streets with no place to go. We have seen many other parishes in El Paso and the neighboring Diocese of Las Cruces open their doors to shelter immigrant families. These days, it is not unusual for our network of service providers to assist up to 600 to 1,000 family members a day. And while the lack of collaboration we often see between CBP and ICE makes our work that much more difficult, we welcome the opportunity to assist the families. I remember vividly when the first bus of asylum seekers arrived at our shelter. The families didn't know where they were going, many thinking that they were being transported to another detention facility. When they realized that they were being greeted and welcomed by shelter volunteers, I saw their joy and relief. I've seen firsthand through our work that the vast majority of these arriving families are fleeing violence and persecution. Families forced to flee after receiving threats to their children when the parents are unable to pay the demanded extortion fee. Families threatened when sons and daughters refuse to join the local gang or become gang girlfriends. While there have been efforts to frame our existing laws and policies as pull factors for arriving families and children, this is not the case. Our efforts to treat these asylum seekers with justice and compassion are not pull factors, just as efforts to deter them are not dissuading children and families from fleeing. These families that we serve are extremely thankful for the assistance and compassion that they receive at our community respite centers. They are eager to comply with our laws in the United States and do not want to be a burden or pitied. Rather, they seek to be treated with dignity and given a chance to find protection, contribute to our country, and provide for their children. Unfortunately, there are serious concerns about the mistreatment families receive along the dangerous migration journey and sometimes at the hands of U.S. Border Patrol. My brother bishops and I also remain deeply troubled by the administration's recent efforts to curtail the ability of asylum seekers arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border to seek protection. To be clear, the concern should not be primarily for the NGOs or our community. We're certainly stressed, but we are also blessed to be able to serve. The greater concern should be for those vulnerable children and families who are suffering greatly from the impact of our government's often ill-conceived and heartless policies. Policies have consequences, and the impact of the administration's recent policies can be measured in the injury and death of many whose only crime is that they fled here to preserve the lives of their families. I appreciate the subcommittee's attention to this important issue, and I ask you to consider the recommendations set forth in my written testimony. Our nation has had a long and proud history of providing humane treatment to and due process for asylum seekers. We must reject policies and proposals that would abandon this tradition, and I ask our government to remember that those fleeing to our border are not the other, but people possessed of the same human dignity as we. The border wall and recent policy proposals focused on the border are treating a symptom and not a cause. They are a symbol of a failure on the part of our country to resolve the issues that could be dealt with by a comprehensive immigration reform. They are a response to our affluent nation's unwillingness to love our neighbor countries, as well as the immigrant and asylum seeker. They are a sign of our broken relationship with God. This reinforced wall and inhumane policies will heal no wounds, solve no problems, but stand as a further scar on our land, dividing our families, our cities, and our nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Sheriff?
Good morning. Subcommittee Chairman Rice, Ranking Member Higgins, it is an honor to have the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee this morning. Pima County, Arizona is the largest of the 31 border counties with a 125-mile linear exposure to the international border and a population of just over 1 million. In many places, the international border is non-distinguishable, meaning there is literally nothing there to secure or otherwise define our international border. To suggest that there does not exist a crisis on our southern border is intellectually dishonest. To be steadfast in that assertion despite clear evidence to the contrary is to be intellectually dishonest with malice. To promulgate the idea that this is a crisis created or manufactured by the current administration is simply false. No reasonable thinking person could assume the current administration has sought to entice families with children and unaccompanied minors to come in caravans to our border, or in some manner sought an escalation of the trafficking of hard narcotics into our country. I've been in Pima County for 32 years. We have had a border crisis for all 32 years that I've been in Pima County. The nuances and the elements of that crisis have evolved over time, but nonetheless, we've had a crisis all this while. The unprecedented increase in family unit migration and the public health emergency associated with drug addiction are real, not manufactured or the product of some nefarious political scheme. Prior administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have recognized and affirmed the existence of a crisis on the border and the need for border security. There are three unimpeachable reasons that, without respect to political ideology, we should embrace as reasons to address this crisis and secure our border with Mexico. They are public safety, national security, and human rights. With respect to public safety, the lack of a secure border presents a public safety crisis not only for border counties, but also for our nation. The porous border is being exploited by drug and human traffickers. We are interdicting unprecedented amounts of methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl. According to Arizona HIDTA in 2018 alone, 113,286 pounds of methamphetamine, 7,949 pounds of heroin, 204,932 fentanyl pills were seized just along the southwest border of the United States. These are absolutely shocking numbers. Migrants are being victimized financially, criminally, and sexually as they make the journey from Mexico and Central America to our border. The lack of a border security is an undeniable public safety crisis. With respect to human rights, tacitly encouraging people in Mexico and Central America to make the dangerous journey to our border is not compassionate public policy. Southwest Border Sheriff deputies recover more than 100 bodies a year in the remote areas of our counties. Migrants are dying in our deserts. The composition of migrants has changed significantly over the past several years. Previously, the majority were single males from Mexico traveling as individuals or in small groups. Now the majority are other than Mexican and comprised of family units, women, children, and unaccompanied minors. As federal resources have been strained past the breaking point, asylum seekers are being released into border communities. An estimated 7,000 people have been released into Pima County just over the past several months, pending asylum hearings. Just this past week, 213 people were released, of which 112, or 53%, were children. Once released into our community, we're obligated to provide adequate care for them. This has nearly collapsed our local social services network. Our NGOs and their volunteers are stressed to the breaking point and beyond. Social service resources that should address local issues of hunger and homelessness are now unable to do so. The lack of a secure border is an undeniable humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian crisis is compelling and should bring leaders of both parties together to find solutions. The border crisis is real. I know as a border sheriff, I live with it every day. However, to caption it as a border crisis, while true, is misleading. There were 70,000 opioid-related overdose deaths last year, more than for motor vehicle traffic accidents. Law enforcement officers now carry medicine, Narcan, on their persons like they might a flashlight or a radio, in the hope of saving just a few lives. This was unimaginable but a few years ago. Without a doubt, these drugs are coming through our southern border. Gang members and hardened criminals are using this crisis to enter our country undetected, to prey upon our citizens and make our communities less safe. Migrants are being victimized on both sides of the border, and our inability to care for them once here, despite the best efforts of my federal partners, only serves to compound their misery. Human traffickers and drug traffickers are profiteering from this crisis and only seek to escalate it. We need action from Washington, D.C., not partisan politics. We need significant and meaningful additional resources to bolster both our public safety and our humanitarian efforts to address this crisis. Finally, we need comprehensive, thoughtful, and detailed legislative action to address a permanent resolution to this crisis. I've lived and worked in a border county for more than 30 years. All that time, leadership in Washington, D.C. have acknowledged the challenge of border security and sought to some varying degrees to address it. Yet here we are. Let us affirm today that no sheriff will sit before Congress 30 years from now and say, we should do something. Honorable members of this community, we must do something now. The degradation of public safety, the humanitarian crisis, and the concern for national security mandate that we do so. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you, and I welcome questions from the subcommittee. Thank you.
I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony, and I will remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. Bishop, I'd like to start with you. There has been a lot of heated rhetoric coming from this administration, and specifically the president, but others in the administration, regarding the type of people who are coming here and requesting asylum. And I think it's really important, if we're going to have an honest conversation here, for us to agree that we're going to deal with the facts. And so what I'd like to ask you to do is if you could just talk more about the people that you are servicing, asylum seekers, the family units. Can you just talk more about what brought them here, what they're fleeing, their character, what they're like? I mean, if you listen to this administration, these are all murderers and rapists and drug dealers, and I just don't think that that's factually accurate, but tell me if I'm wrong.
We who work with the asylum seekers every day wish that those who speak about them have the chance to simply meet them and talk to them. And we invite people to come and visit our border area and just spend a few moments with them. We've been receiving, for instance, at the shelter on my property, around 80 a day as an average. And I have the opportunity just about every day to go by and visit. I find people that are extremely humble, very grateful, good moms and dads who have loving relationships with their children. I think that if that relationship wasn't there, it would be pretty obvious to us. But we see the way that they care for them, and they're concerned for them, for instance, when they have a cold or a fever or something like that. They are people of tremendous faith, and they're often asking us to pray and to pray with them. I've been inspired by my opportunity to be with them. We have, in the months since November that we've had this shelter, we have not had a single experience of violence or any kind of expression like that, of anger even. All we've found is people humbly trying to escape very, very difficult situations in their home countries. Some of their children show that signs of malnutrition, that they just, because of the chaos and violence in their countries, they can't make a living anymore.
Thank you, Bishop. Mr. Olivares, I want to talk to you because I have to say that I was really well educated being recently down at the border, and I wish that every single American, and certainly, well, at the very least, every member of Congress could go and look. We happen to be in McAllen, and I'd just like to see if you could kind of expound on where the wall is going up and how to just explain a little bit more about this no man's land, because I didn't understand it until I actually saw it, that the wall is not actually preventing anyone from coming to this country and claiming asylum. It literally is just walling off all those thousands of acres and taking property from people without just compensation. I mean, I'm from New York. I knew the president before he was president, and I feel safe saying that if anyone tried to take any part of his real estate empire away from him, he would not allow that to happen. But he didn't have to worry about that because he had an army of lawyers that he could afford to pay for. These people don't. And so I think it's really important for the American people and certainly members of Congress to understand where this wall, I mean, we met with a CBP officer and we said, what is the number one thing that we can give you that will help you here? They didn't say a wall. He didn't say a wall. He said, we need more personnel, which is what Congress allotted $65 million for. So having said all that, if you could just explain a little more about what, just if you can, what is going to be created by putting this wall in a place that is really just going to create, as you said, a no man's land.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That is right. In Hidalgo County, there's a flood control levee that runs parallel to the river, more or less. Now, it's not exactly parallel because the river turns and twists, but on that border control levee, that's where the government is planning to build a border wall. Now, that levee is in some places half a mile from the river, 3/4 of a mile, over a mile from the river, and all of that area is going to be walled off completely. Now, who lives in that area? One of our clients, Mr. Cavazos, he's a 69-year-old man. He's paralyzed from the waist down. He makes a living by raising cattle and leasing some of his riverfront property for recreational purposes. Now, his entire property is going to be walled off. His tenants have already explained that if the wall is built as planned, they're not going to renew their lease. So he's going to lose his livelihood, him and his family. And these are communities that have been there for a long time. I wish these were, individuals concerned about losing their empire. They're losing their livelihood. It's changing their way of life. And this stretches along the southeast tip of Texas, Cameron County, Hidalgo County, and Starr counties. Another concern there is the flooding concerns. We're in a hurricane zone. Every summer, we get tropical depressions, tropical storms, and hurricanes most summers. Now, what's going to happen when you wall that off? If the river overflows, the wall is going to prevent water from running over. Even though there's still bollards, steel posts that are going to make up the wall, that gets clogged up with any flooding, with debris and branches and trash and whatnot. So that's going to do two things. The water is going to stagnate in the no man's land, and it's going to divert disproportionately to the Mexican side. On the northern side of the wall, especially in the more populated areas in Stark County, such as Rio Grande City and Roma, Texas, the water that would normally run off into the river and drain into the Gulf of Mexico is going to be prevented from draining into the river because of the wall. It's literally going to create a dam effect, and it's going to flood those cities. And in my written submission, I've included some of the flooding models that have been developed about it. And I worry seriously that one day when the next serious hurricane hits our area, if this wall is built, we're going to be crying over the deaths of people, quite literally.
Well, it's also not going to prevent anyone from crossing and reaching American soil. Thank you. Mr. Higgins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Let us clarify that the layered security that we describe is called for on our southern border, calls for enhanced technology to detect a pending illegal crossing, enhanced physical barrier to delay and deter that illegal crossing, enhanced capacity to respond to the detected and delayed or deterred illegal crossing with all-weather roads, additional vehicles, manpowers, et cetera, and enhanced capacity to process those that have been apprehended once they have crossed into our country, if they do so successfully. So the concept of that's sort of presented to America, let us be solid with this, my friends. I thank you for appearing. I appreciate your passion, and I recognize our differences in ideological perspective of this challenge we face. But we are at a point of collapse in our southern border. The sovereignty of our nation is at stake, and we have to move forward with a cautious focus on what it is to maintain the America that we serve. And this layered security that we're describing is not the Great Wall of China. And I would ask Sheriff Napier, regarding manpower and humanitarian crisis, there's a crisis on the law enforcement side of this badge. If you had more money, could you hire more deputies, Sheriff?
Ranking Member Higgins, it's very difficult right now to hire law enforcement officers. If we had more money, I'm currently struggling, as most law enforcement executives are, with hiring good people. It's a very difficult environment right now to hire people in the law enforcement, whether it be on the federal side or the local side. We need
How long have you been a sheriff on the border, sir? Just clarify.
I've been in law enforcement in the border area for 30 years, and
Have you ever seen anything like this right now?
I've never seen anything like our current crisis. The crisis has always existed. The current crisis is staggering.
Are there locations along the border that you could refer to that would benefit from enhanced physical barriers with 21st century technology to detect and with enhanced capacity to respond? Are there areas that of our southern border that would be more secure? Should we make this investment?
This strategic deployment of physical barriers along our southern border will always be part of a total border security package, and administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have realized that in the past and supported physical barrier deployment. That'll always be just one part of this total picture of border security. We'll always need to buttress that with technology and human resources. So it's going to have to be a very comprehensive solution, because the border is not a single thing. It's 2,000 linear miles and varying topography, varying land use issues. So we're going to have to look at a very comprehensive solution.
Thank you for that. Bishop, thank you for your service to the church and to our fellow man, sir. The sun does not set upon the glory of God through the church. And I thank you for your service and your compassion. I would ask you, does the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops work with its counterparts in Central America to warn parents and children of the dangers of this trek? You talked about malnutrition, and I'm certainly concerned as a compassionate man about these families. What is the church doing in Central America to stem this flow before we reach this humanitarian crisis that you're encountering in your shelters?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. I've had the opportunity to serve for a short time in Central America and to visit, and I have friends who are members of the clergy there. They have been working very hard since my first exposure to the life there to dissuade people from leaving their home and to begin to address to the degree they're
Just in the interest of time, Bishop, I don't mean to cut you off. So is there an active engagement between the church and authorities and organizations in Central America to deter this trafficking of humans?
There is an active engagement, but the problem is that the governments are so weak and so corrupt that there's no authority on the governmental level that people can go to. The church is about the only one.
And I have one brief question, Madam, if you will indulge me for the bishop, regarding the sovereignty of the church and as it relates and compares with the sovereignty of our nation. The church has been a light for the world for 2,000 years, a place of refuge, a place where any child of God could seek spiritual prosperity. But the sovereignty of the church has been protected by the security of the church. One of the most famous walls in history is the wall around the Vatican. And I would ask you, Bishop, in the area that you serve, do your churches lock their doors after hours?
Many of them do. I would point out that wall you refer to at the Vatican also has arms embracing and opening to the world. If you've been at the
Yes,
Plaza.
we do. Sir, we have 328 ports of entry for legal entry into our country in the United States of America. And Madam Chairwoman, I thank you for your indulgence. My time has expired, and thank you all for appearing today.
Chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bishop, can you discuss the long-term impacts of the President's policies on immigrant families, and how will the continuation of these policies affect the ability of organizations such as yours to care for families? We see that we have gotten into this habit of locking children in cages, in fences, and feeling that will deter people from coming here. But there has to be something that is pushing these people to come here, irrespective of the dangers that they know, irrespective of the plight that they might face, that they're willing to take that chance. You know, Moses was put in a cradle and pushed down a river in order to save him. That must have been dangerous to do, but the options that his mother had at that time, she was willing to take that chance. Talk to me about the impacts of these policies of the President.
Well, one of the most important points that I think I could share today is that if we really want to address border security, we need to look at the sending countries and their circumstances there, right, which are beyond what most Americans can even imagine. People are fleeing. They're not simply coming because they want a better car. They're fleeing for their lives and for their children's lives. We as a country can do much to support the improvement of the situations in those countries, as we worked with Colombia, for instance, to improve their circumstances. What we're creating here in this country now is extremely concerning. The incarceration that many of these asylum seekers are receiving is having long-term effects on their health, especially the health of their children. I talked to kids who were incarcerated at Tornillo, and they're still having nightmares and having to deal with their experience. Families that, even with documents, very often are living in fear when they see Border Patrol vehicles and so on, because they believe that simply because they look like they're coming from that place and might not have documents, they're already under suspicion.
Absolutely. We know in a lot of the cities and areas along the border that have American citizens that might look like the immigrants that are coming up. In cities, they're stopped on the streets and asked, are you legal? Who are you? What are you? I mean, I'm just concerned about the road that this country is going down. I mean, when was asylum all right? Now that it's wants to be vilified, it makes me ask what people are allowed, to come here, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And now the borders are locked, no entrance. We don't want anyone.
Yes. It's also interesting that we helped write those asylum laws, and we've held other countries accountable who have received a much higher percentage than we're beginning to look at here in this country.
Yes. Well, thank you. It just makes me wonder what it is about these people that now we want to shut our borders. And with that, I'll yield back.
Chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for having this hearing today. Sheriff Napier, thank you for coming before the subcommittee, and I would specifically like to thank you for a portion of your written statement where you said, to suggest that there does not exist a crisis on our southern border is intellectually dishonest. To be steadfast in that assertion, despite clear evidence to the contrary, is to be intellectually dishonest with malice. To promulgate this idea that a crisis created or manufactured by the current administration is simply false. I recently was part of a congressional delegation to the trip to Yuma, Arizona, a neighbor of yours. And I must say, I could not agree with you any more that your assessment reflects that this clearly is a crisis, sir. While I was there, I witnessed firsthand the lack of a secure border in areas along the Colorado River, which allows the cartels to smuggle drugs into our country, drugs that end up affecting all of American citizens on one level or another. There is also a newer problem with a surge of people who seek to be apprehended, seek to be brought into custody, and say the prescribed words and be allowed to have access to American jobs, American health care, education, like the law-abiding Americans, with no ability to verify their claims. Is the experience that I recently had while I was in Arizona with a delegation of congressmen and women, is this experience what you see on a daily basis, sir?
Thank you for the question. It is clear that we have a public safety and a humanitarian crisis on our southern border. We know that the escalation of the trafficking of hard narcotics into our country is unprecedented. I don't say that as a partisan statement or a political statement. It's a factual one. We have never seen quantities of methamphetamine coming into our country or heroin in the quantities that is coming in now. When we interdict 58 pounds of methamphetamine, we know two things. One, that methamphetamine is not being cooked in the United States. And furthermore, that's not going to be consumed in my county. It's going all over our nation. When we interdicted 13,000 fentanyl pills, we know they were not manufactured in the United States and they were not destined for consumption in Pima County. This is a national problem. The public safety aspect of our border crisis is compelling. It's not a political statement. I'm charged with public safety in my county, not partisan politics. The humanitarian crisis is also compelling. Deputies recover dozens of bodies a year in the deserts of my county. How we could not think of that as a humanitarian crisis. And as the bishop points out, people in Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, are facing desperate life conditions that we in this room, with food in our stomachs, roof over our head, and safety, cannot imagine. And they're coming here out of desperation, but that journey is arduous, it's dangerous, it's bought with all kinds of perils, criminality, sexual abuse, financial abuse. This is a humanitarian and public safety crisis of compelling and unprecedented nature. It's not a manufactured crisis or a partisan crisis. And I hope that the people in Washington, D.C. can come across the aisle, both Republican and Democrat, and look for solutions to this problem. Because long after this is not fodder for political debate in Washington, D.C., Pima County and the border region will be my home. That's my home. It's where my family lives. It's where my granddaughter lives. So this is significantly important to me and the people of my county.
Thank you, sir. Like you, I do believe it's necessary to build protective barriers where it makes sense. We do have the ability with some companies, like I saw, to deploy a mile of new barrier every single day. In the interim, CBP has a critical shortage of manpower, which has already resulted in agents being pulled from their primary role in order to protect the border. DHS and the President have explored the option of increasing the National Guard presence to alleviate personnel shortages. In your experience, Sheriff, do you believe that that would be helpful?
It does have great efficacy when we can take military assets, military personnel, and deploy them to non-enforcement, non-contact type activities that otherwise Border Patrol or CBP would be tasked with doing. And that allows them to deploy their resources on a frontline basis to bolster their capacities. So it makes perfect sense from a public policy standpoint and from an operational deployment of personnel to bolster those resources with military personnel in non-enforcement, non-contact roles, yes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for protecting our country. Thank you for protecting the sovereignty of our country.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Torres Small.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Varela, it's great to see a fellow Las Crucen at the witness panel. And thank you so much for your work in border life, border trade, and border opportunity. I deeply appreciate it. As you know, last month, CBP reassigned hundreds of port officers to port officers to Border Patrol sectors along the southwestern border. And in my district, in Santa Teresa Port of Entry, which with you're well familiar, we lost an estimated 20% of our workforce, resulting in the closure of multiple commercial lanes and a wait time of up to 6 hours for trucks to cross the border. Can you please describe how these wait times are affecting the business of local companies that depend on a stable supply chain?
Congresswoman, it's great to see you as well, and also fellow Georgetown grad, so Hoya Sachs, if I might be digressing a bit. I want to be very clear about what is happening with the wait times, and they are indeed starting to have a very devastating impact on the Borderplex region. Between 15 and 30% of the retail trade on a given time, any time of the year in our Borderplex region is done by Mexican nationals. Frankly, we don't have the bricks and mortar problem that many, many communities have because Mexican nationals with the burgeoning middle class because of trade, and I mentioned in my comments that the unemployment rate has dropped, is creating this type of opportunity. So yes, we are also experiencing problems with individuals crossing to support retail trade in our area on the U.S. side of the border. The manufacturing sector, the logistics sector, all the other sectors that are into the symbiotic relationship between the two countries are beginning to have a severe and very, very adverse impact. We represent over 250 businesses in our region, and we've had dozens of people call us in the last couple of weeks describing the very hard, very difficult impact, adverse impact that they have experienced. In many cases, there have been temporary layoffs, there have been shuttering of businesses, There have been trucking companies that have been idling for up to 24 hours, not only in Santa Teresa, but on the El Paso side of the border, and that's simply unacceptable. There are businesses in each and every one of your districts and in states that rely upon this very sophisticated supply chain that will have to come to a closure situation sooner than later if we don't resolve this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Varela. I would love to let you go on. I have a few more questions, but I deeply appreciate your testimony there. You mentioned some of the modernization that we've experienced at Santa Teresa, but do you believe that there are more federal investments that can be made to allow Santa Teresa Port of Entry to continue to increase trade to Mexico?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you. I think just a yes or no on this one. So
yes,
thank
absolutely.
you.
Sure.
I'd like to move on now because, as you know, last month, CBP began releasing thousands of individuals, mostly families, into border communities with a notice to appear at immigration hearings. In my district, CBP has at times released hundreds of people a day. And with our local and county governments, nonprofit organizations, and faith-based organizations have stepped up with empathy, care, and compassion. But the administration has failed in assisting these local communities with this federal issue. Bishop Saenz, how is your organization affected when CBP does not notify you in advance of releasing hundreds of individuals and family members into your community?
It has a tremendous effect on us because we're dealing, as I mentioned, with something like 800 to 1,000 people a day, and we're capable of receiving them and providing them a place. But if they're simply, it's simply announced that they're going to be released at the last moment, or without any preparation, it's difficult. And Border Patrol hasn't had experience in that. They used to hand them off to ICE, but now that's not always happening.
I appreciate you bringing up that point. What are the challenges you see with helping migrants reach their final destinations and arranging travel arrangements that the sponsors are paying for?
Well, very often we're finding that people are being released without having been processed, without receiving the papers that they need, without the documents that they would need to travel further, and also sometimes to the streets. So we're unable to connect them with that network we've created to assist them.
Thank you, Bishop. I yield my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. To each of you, I want to thank you for taking time away from your families, for traveling to be with us today to discuss these important issues. I believe that what we are talking about today is the most pressing issue that we face as a nation, and it's something that we are grappling with each and every day as members of Congress. Sheriff, I want to thank you for your 30-plus years of service to the people of your state, the people of your district. I want to ask you, throughout your testimony, I see that you speak of what appear to be multiple crises that exist along our southwest border. You speak of a drug trafficking crisis. I see here that you've listed over a period of just over a year, 5 different seizures of methamphetamine that total over 200 pounds of methamphetamine. You talk about seizures of fentanyl. You talk about one seizure alone in 2018 being 13,000 dosage units. I don't see anything here about cocaine. I'm assuming that we've not stopped the flow of cocaine into the country and that we are continuing to see that drug flow. Would that be correct?
That is correct. Cocaine is less pronounced right now, but methamphetamine and fentanyl and the opiate-based drugs are our major concern, but cocaine has not gone away by a long stretch.
And Sheriff, you talked about or touched on it very briefly. The amount of narcotics that you are seeing coming across our border, that's not personal use. Those are drugs that are intended to be introduced first into the country, and then those are drugs that are going to be shipped across our country and sold in each of our communities to our families and friends. Is that correct?
That is correct, and shocking is the fact that there were 70,000 opioid-related overdose deaths last year, and that is more significant in number than the number of deaths from automobile accidents. Deputies now carry medicine on their person, like they would a flashlight or a radio, in the hope of saving some lives. This is unthinkable. To not caption this as a crisis, I don't understand.
And Sheriff, I want to talk very briefly also, you talk on page 4 of your report about the human trafficking crisis. Can you talk about that just very briefly, what you're seeing along the southwest border?
Well, we know that the migrants are being exploited both financially and sexually, criminally on their journey from Central America and Mexico into the United States. Estimates say that some of these migrants are paying upwards of $7,000 to be shepherded into the United States, and then often brought a very short distance into the U.S. and then abandoned. And as a result, they don't have sufficient water or food to care for themselves, and that ends in death in the desert. We know that the human smuggling, the RAND Corporation just did a study that says human smuggling may be upward of a $2 billion industry, operated in collaboration with the drug cartels, so they may not be actually involved, but they control the avenues of ingress into the United States. So this is a very serious public safety problem that the profiteering off of the migrants is a very significant problem, to the tune of probably upward of $1 billion a year.
And Sheriff, you also said in your report there on page 4 that just this week, that's the week that you wrote the report, that there were heavily armed persons who were observed escorting a migrant woman and child at the border. You say in your report these individuals were wearing tactical gear and possessing military-style equipment. The public safety threat of this is significant. Could you expound on that just a little bit, please?
This is a relatively new phenomenon, but we had on video surveillance a woman and an 8-year-old child being escorted by 5 heavily armed, military-style equipped persons, shepherded them to the border and then across the border, which obviously presents a public safety challenge to us in law enforcement that might have confronted these people. They were heavily armed. They were very, very serious criminals. And we don't know what engagement this woman and her child made with these armed persons to get there, which ought to give anybody pause from a humanitarian standpoint of what agreement was made between that woman and an 8-year-old child to be brought in the United States in that manner.
And so we have operating to some extent along our southwest border heavily armed individuals who are wearing tactical gear and using military equipment that are involved in both human trafficking and drug trafficking. Is that your testimony, Sheriff?
That is my testimony, and that is also something that is not new. It's been going on for 30 years. It was marijuana trade prior to this, and it's been going on for decades.
And then finally, you speak about the immigration crisis and the effect that it has on your community on page 5, and then page 6 about the near collapse of social services networks and the ability to handle the increase in immigration. Can you speak on that very briefly?
Yes, after the asylum seekers are granted an asylum hearing, they're being released into our community, and we have, as compassionate Christian people, an affirmative responsibility to provide adequate care for them. And that has really strained our NGOs and our social service network to the point of collapse. We had 7,000 people released just over the last several months, more than 200 just in the past week, and it's very straining to our social service network. So we need some support out of Washington, D.C. to our NGOs, our local nonprofits, and our law enforcement, and be able to confront this crisis. We need real relief. We need real resources. We need meaningful action out of Washington, D.C. to confront this crisis that is not academic in our part of the world. It's a very real thing that we live with every day.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the witnesses for appearing. Bishop, with your consent and permission, may I call you Father?
You may.
My grandfather was a preacher, and I have great reverence and respect for persons who are what, in my community, we call men of God. Bishop, you may not be familiar with this, so I will call it to your attention more specifically. Voltaire, the great writer, philosopher, intellectual, reminded us that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Bishop, would you agree with Voltaire?
Certainly.
And Father, if I may ask, Do you believe that the women and children who are paying these inordinate amounts of money, who are putting their children at risk of being harmed, heard the term sexually assaulted, do you believe that they are an invading force?
I think it's unfortunate when they're characterized in that kind of matter, when people speak in generalities to the very small percentage who are taking advantage of the situation, as though that characterizes the whole.
And may I assume that you do not consider them an invading force?
I don't think we've ever seen an invasion like that before.
And Bishop, Father, if I may say so, do you think that these persons should pay a fee to be processed who are coming? Traditionally, our law has not required a fee of them. Do you think they should pay a fee?
Well, it's something I'd have to give more thought to give you a complete answer. Certainly, they can be part of that process, but unfortunately, the fees that I know many of people are facing are extraordinary right now. I've talked to people from Canada who received citizenship here. It cost them $10,000.
Well, we're talking about now those who are seeking asylum, who have traditionally not had to do this in the sense that I'm hearing now. Just heard a report about some desire to affix a fee. But moving right along, you mentioned Canada. Now, Father, this question goes to the heart. Do you believe that if these were white babies coming from Canada, we would separate them from their mothers to the extent that we have, that we would lose them such that we cannot reconnect them to their parents? Dear Father, do you believe this?
I am concerned that, at least unconsciously, there may well be a bias against people of color that sometimes expresses itself among some.
And dear Sheriff, my dear brother, I assure you, I concur with you, and I think that there is more than a humanitarian crisis. But I ask you candidly, do you believe that just as it relates to the humanitarian crisis you've identified, do you believe that a wall alone will solve the humanitarian crisis? A simple yes or no will do for starters, given that I have little time left.
If you're limiting me to a yes or no answer, the answer is no. It will not solve the problem by itself.
I thank you. And I believe you have the intellect to explain further that there are other aspects of this that have to be dealt with. And I concur with you. But I also know this. A great country is not going to be measured, its greatness is not going to be measured by how we treat the people who live in the suites of life. It will be measured by how we treat people in the streets of life, people who are coming, people who should be allowed to benefit from the golden rule that we would apply to ourselves, Father, do unto others. My time is up, and I thank the chair for the additional seconds. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Chairwoman Rice and Ranking Member Higgins, thank you very much, both of you, for holding this most important hearing. Gentlemen, thank you for being here as well. It's a very interesting issue we have before us. I just got back from Mexico City. I was there Thursday talking to Mexican officials about NAFTA, NAFTA 2. While I was there, the U.S. became, Mexico became America's biggest trading partner, to a great extent because of the tariffs on Canadian and Chinese products. But you begin to see the patterns here. If you were to take a pencil and draw a circle, plus minus 200 miles on each side of the border, you'd probably have the 10th largest economy in the world. just that border region, a lot of economic activity. 2 months ago, I was took a tour, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Wanted to look at what was going on at just where folks live, try to live, and where people immigrate from. Saw a lot of eye-openers. The biggest thing that I came back with, the aha, was that all of our drug money, people are insatiable thirst for drugs in this country. It doesn't matter how you get it here. This society consumes drugs at an alarming rate. And those dollars over there are creating so much chaos, so much corruption, that there aren't anybody there who can resist that. They tell the folks over there, either you take the gold or we're going to put some lead in your head. And that's what's creating a lot of the chaos. There are no institutions of law. You don't have predictability so business can set up to create jobs because there's so much corruption. At the same time, I did find some silver linings in those dark clouds. In El Salvador, I got to visit a fusion center, and Sheriff, you might know what a fusion center is, where we had the USDA, US FBI, US authorities, local authorities working together to identify the bad guys, the bad girls coming in and out of Central America and the US. And Sheriff, you mentioned a couple of things, and I'm trying to figure out the big picture. We can talk about the refugee crisis, we can talk about records, but the fact of the matter is, we've had a refugee crisis from Central America in this country since the 1980s, and yet we've ignored it. And now because these caravans, 7,000 people, and I asked people in Honduras, I said, Mr. President, who's putting these caravans together? Could never get a straight answer. I know social media had something to do with it, but I look at it from a political perspective. Both sides have something to gain. You got a TV camera show 7,000 people, it's an invasion. But 20 years ago, it was quiet. Unless we create economic development in Central America, you're not going to stop this crisis. And it's interesting because the Chinese, talking to El Salvador's president, the Chinese want to build a deep water port in El Salvador. They want to buy 75% of the Salvadoran coastline to bring them economic development. And I propose to you, gentlemen and folks, this is our economic sphere of influence. It's to our best interest to stabilize Central America. And great speakers, I've heard your comments. We do have a crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis driven by people that are desperate. My district is 200 miles from the border. The other day, my local priest from one of my local churches came to me with a refugee candidate, both hands chopped off. Is this a person who would be a refugee? We're going to have to figure it out. But Sheriff, you did have an interesting thought, which was to open up centers to apply for refugee status in Central America. I hope you figure this out. Try to put the politics out of this issue and work on for lack of a better term, a Marshall Plan from Central America. Because 70 years ago, it was to our best interest to stabilize Europe. It's to our best interest today to stabilize the Americas. It's common sense. Mexico's kind of stable. Now we got to figure out Central America. And by the way, the Mexicans are also addressing this issue because it's causing them challenges as well. Madam Secretary, Madam Chairperson, I'm running out of time. I yield the remainder of my 2 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Correa. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. With that, I ask unanimous consent to insert a statement from Church World Service into the hearing record. Without objection, the subcommittee record shall be kept open for 10 days.
Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following items: a brief from the RAND Corporation on human smuggling and the January statement on border security from the Southwestern Border Sheriffs.
Without objection. Hearing no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.
Mr. Higgins, Bill is moving on Veterans Affairs.
It's great. I get to be the cannabis guy in a conservative district.
You get